Hello, I'm Dr. Daniel Griffin,
And I'm Dixon Dupommier.
and today we will be discussing tuberculosis. Now, tuberculosis is an infection caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, a pretty significant pathogen in the history of the world.
Also.
Some would suggest that more people have died from tuberculosis than any single other pathogen in human history.
Wow.
And it continues to be a major killer. It's one of the top 3 causes of death. We've got HIV/AIDS, we've got malaria, and tuberculosis. And maybe tuberculosis is number 1 with about 1 million deaths per year. Pretty significant.
It is. People, think that we live in the 21st century. We've got flat screen televisions. We can travel anywhere in the world. How could there be tuberculosis?
No, an excellent question.
But there still is.
Yeah. And I'll say not only is tuberculosis important in human history, but this is actually what got me interested in infectious disease.
All right.
I know you always thought it was attending your parasitology lectures,
Well.
which I found interesting.
But you did attend them at least. That was good.
And I attended. But no, it was during my time at Bellevue at NYU School of Medicine that my mentor, who was a fellow mountaineer, was doing tuberculosis research. He was in the pulmonary division.
Okay.
And I actually went and worked in his lab for a while.
Great.
And that sort of got me excited about trying to generate new knowledge to contribute to the medical corpus. And it was research on tuberculosis.
Wow.
So let's talk a little bit. So we've already established it's a bacteria,
Yes.
Mycobacterium
Special
tuberculosis.
kind of bacteria.
A special, in a sense, higher order type of bacterium.
Yeah.
It has a different surface, a mycolic acid surface, so it
Exactly.
stains differently. This is one of our acid-fast bacteria.
Hard to kill.
Hard to kill, slow growing.
Very good.
There are fast-growing mycobacterium that we won't discuss today, but Mycobacterium tuberculosis is sort of a slow, prodding,
Exactly.
very successful organism. It's suggested that 1/3 of the world's population is currently infected with Mycobacterium tuberculosis.
Incredible.
Let me say that one more time. 1/3, 30% of the planet.
That's
So billions of
7.6 billion.
Divide that by 3. Can you do that in your head? That's okay.
No, I'm getting there.
So this is a huge problem. When you get exposed to tuberculosis, only about 10% of people will ever get sick.
Right.
And so that's a challenge. So when I say that 1/3 of the people on the planet are infected, 90% of them will never get sick. A minority will get sick. About half of those people who are exposed to tuberculosis will get sick within the first year or 2. And the other half of the 10% who will get sick sometime in their lifetime. And it may be many, many decades later when maybe they're older, when maybe their immune system can't control the infection.
Yes.
Tuberculosis can affect our lungs, and that's what mainly we're going to talk about today, our pulmonary tuberculosis, which makes up about 90% of the cases of tuberculosis. But we can also have tuberculosis affect, we're going to go through the list.
Please.
You can name any part of the body. Our lymph nodes.
Can you have dermatologic tuberculosis?
We can not only have tuberculosis infect the skin, but we can actually have the tuberculoids, which are cutaneous or skin manifestations that are an inflammatory response to low inoculum tuberculosis infection, but a hypervigilant immune response.
Got it.
You could have tuberculosis affect the joints,
Wow.
the spine, the lining of the heart, the lining of the abdomen, so you can have an abdominal. Really anywhere. You can even have tuberculosis in the meninges, in the central nervous system.
Good heavens.
So we have TB manifesting in many, many ways. We're not going to be able to cover it all. So today we're going to focus mainly on pulmonary tuberculosis.
How is it acquired?
Breathing. I always tell people not to breathe.
Or if you must breathe, breathe out.
I like that. Actually, that is an interesting feature of tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is airborne. It's an airborne transmission. It's
Droplet.
you produce droplet nuclei. Droplet nuclei are small enough that they'll actually float around. And they might float around for as much as half an hour after someone coughs or sneezes. A nice thing is children do not have a proper cough reflex. They can't produce dispersible droplet nuclei, so I always feel a little more comfortable taking care of children. But once someone reaches about 16 years of age, they can adequately produce droplet nuclei. They can fill a room.
Wow. And what about fomites? I always worry that, I'm not a New Yorker by birth, but I'm a New Yorker by trade because I've worked in New York City all of my adult life, basically. And you go to the subway, and you look down on the platform of the subway, and you see these little round black spots. Okay. And someone once asked me what those little round black spots were, and I said, that's discarded chewing gum.
Okay.
So underneath the discarded chewing gum is portions of their saliva and their oral cavity, and perhaps something that they've coughed up. If they had tuberculosis and they were actively throwing out bacteria, could any of those bacteria survive in those conditions?
So the nice thing, and this is going to be important, because this is one of those diseases where the people taking care, the staff, the clinicians, can potentially get sick while taking care.
Of course.
And the good or bad, you're going to basically inhale this. Someone has to generate droplet nuclei. Okay, this is not a fomite disease.
So
this
these
is not a hand washing disease.
Oh, okay.
This is going to be an inhaling exposure.
Okay.
One of the triage things, and this, as we've talked about the way clinics are set up, is the individual might come to the clinic.
Yep.
They get checked in. Maybe the chief complaint is recorded. And if the chief complaint is, for instance, cough, a lot of clinics, and actually clinics that I've worked in, we use a 2-week cutoff. If the cough has been going on for more than 2 weeks, that raises the suspicion for tuberculosis.
Right.
You may not want to then have that individual sit in your waiting room with all the children and the young mothers and the pregnant and really anybody.
Sure.
You also probably don't want them sitting right next to all the staff coughing away.
Right.
So a lot of times we'll use a 2-week cough cutoff as a triage, if you have the right incidence of tuberculosis, to have rapid tuberculosis testing before they then get to move on to enter the general population pool.
Right.
2 weeks is a pretty good cutoff in most areas. 3 weeks they might use in some. Other areas you get more into associated symptoms with the cough. Because 2 weeks of cough is actually quite common. Allergic rhinitis, people with allergies.
I was thinking, I've had 2 weeks of cough.
Exactly. And if we were in a more tuberculosis endemic area, I would not sit so close. I would not breathe. I'm not, and that's interesting. The not sit so close, the 6 feet of separation, it's not going to work.
It's not going to work
because it's in the air. It's going to circulate.
That's right.
Fortunately, it usually takes a significant inoculum. This is usually not something you're seeing on subways. There often isn't even transmission in airplanes. It's usually people living with you.
But with a third of the world infected, you're going to have to come up with some other reason why the people go on to get sick than exposure, because 1/3 of the world is, like you said, in the billions of people. Why doesn't everybody get sick?
Why doesn't everyone get sick?
Why don't they get sick?
So we'll do that as an aside right now. Part of it is there does appear to be a genetic susceptibility. And when I was working in Nepal, this is many years ago, I was working at Bir Hospital in Kathmandu. And I used to really enjoy picking up the languages when I would go places. Now I find that quite difficult. And so while I was working long enough at the Bir Hospital that I was studying Nepali a few hours every day after I would work in the hospital. And I was learning, how to order food and do all the basic things, but I also was very interested in the words that they might use for different infections.
Of course.
And they had 2 words for tuberculosis.
Really?
And one of the words was tuberculosis that you catch from someone who's sick, and the other is tuberculosis that runs in families. Oh. And they had noticed that the tuberculosis was clustered in certain families. And when you consider everyone being exposed, you could start to see that.
That's right.
And when the bacteria was first identified by Robert Koch, you can see Harrison's, which is a big textbook of medicine. You can see the 40-page section the year before the bacilli was discovered, explaining the genetic basis and showing the family trees. And then the next year, it becomes very brief, and this is an infectious disease. It's an infectious disease. And all that was forgotten, but maybe not, because there are two questions there. Exposure alone.
That's right.
The second is issues with your immune system. If you have HIV/AIDS, if for some other reason you have cancer, if you're on maybe certain medicines that might reduce your immune system,
Right.
maybe even just age alone. We see reactivation as people become more senior and their immune system can no longer contain the tuberculosis. So let's talk about other associated symptoms. You've got your cough. You may have blood. You may have blood-tinted sputum. That's going to raise your suspicion. You may have weight loss.
Sure.
That's going to raise your suspicion for tuberculosis.
Yeah.
You may have night sweats. People tell you, I wake up in the middle of the night and where I sleep, it's drenched. I have to change the sheets. I have to change my clothes. These are a lot of the things, the wasting that goes associated.
So it's a disease that's captured the imagination of the art world over time also. And I
Yes.
can recall in my brief but significant encounter with world literature that Dostoevsky wrote beautiful descriptions of what cavitary tuberculosis was all about.
Mm-hmm.
I believe the woman's name was Camille.
Okay.
And the book was, I believe, Crime and Punishment, but I'm not sure. It's either that or War and Peace. I think it was Crime and Punishment. But to see this poor individual suffering almost throughout the book from cavitary tuberculosis.
Now, I always remember La Boheme, which is an operetta.
Another
And where
artistic.
And it was actually, at one point, a third of all deaths in Europe were due to tuberculosis. So it found its way into the literature.
Sure.
There's actually, apparently in Bollywood, there was a movement where it was embraced. And so it became, and it's been romanticized, the bullfighter, the dying young.
Yes,
there was a whole,
yes.
which is really interesting when you think of what a horrible disease
It's
and what a
horrible,
horrible
that's right. I mean,
death.
it's
that somehow it
slow,
was
insidious. Awful.
But let's talk about diagnosis. So someone comes in and you're concerned, and again, this is one of those diseases that the world has mobilized to try to target.
Yep.
And there is a technology called GeneXpert. And so traditionally, the diagnosis of tuberculosis reminds me much of malaria. Someone would cough, you would do a smear, you would do this special acid-fast staining,
Sure.
and you would look for basically little red bacilli.
Yep.
And if someone was quite ill, had a high mycobacterial load, the smear might be teeming. If it was less, you might just see a few of them. It required a certain load, and then you might send it off for culture. Culture could take 6 to 8 weeks.
Exactly.
And during that 6 to 8 weeks,
It's very long.
they could be spreading disease. And actually,
Well,
a
of course.
large percentage of tuberculosis historically has been spread by people who are smear negative, but culture positive.
Right.
So this technology, this GeneXpert technology, little cartridges, about that big. So we're going to say 1 or 2 inches tall by an inch square. The person creates sputum. It's put into this cartridge. The cartridge is popped into the machine. The GeneXpert can generate results in about 90 minutes. So we say less than 2 hours,
That's still
which
pretty
is
quick.
much quicker than having to wait 2 months for culture.
That's a fact.
So very quick turnaround. It costs about $10 US per test.
Worth every penny.
And it's been tremendous in case identification. The test also can tell you at that moment in time whether or not it's resistant to some of the frontline agents.
Got it.
So much like HIV/AIDS, a lot of tuberculosis is being, the diagnosis and treatment is being orchestrated by the government and with the help of non-government organizations, where the non-government organizations or the government will be supplying the medications. They'll actually be doing what they call directly observed therapy. So once you've made the diagnosis,
Sure.
they want to make sure the person gets treated.
That's right.
They'll even do contract tracing. So they'll find out this individual is positive. Let's go test their children. Let's go test their parents. Let's test everyone living in that area or the context.
Right.
And so usually we start off with a 4-drug cocktail for the first 2 months, and then we drop down to a 2-drug cocktail. But I'll say the specifics of those treatments are going to go beyond this. And a lot of times they'll be driven by local drug resistance prevalences.
Right. So the big worry I've been led to believe through, lots of publications from WHO and United Nations health surveillance teams around the world is the emergence of multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis that none of these drugs will affect whatsoever. And that hasn't happened on a global basis yet, but everyone is waiting in fear of this happening. Mm-hmm. What's your opinion about that?
So it's happening.
It is happening.
It is happening. In certain areas, there's very high rates of resistance to the frontline drugs, which would be isoniazid and rifampin. So we're having to use inferior drugs. And there certainly are cases now of tuberculosis resistant to all our drugs. So
it's such a slow-growing organism. How can resistance arise? Is this fast or slow in terms of resistance arising?
So it's interesting. The resistance is there to begin with. And so let's take an individual who has a cavitary disease. So they have a big cavity, it's full of tuberculosis.
Right.
Let's say they have 10 to the 11th organisms in that cavity.
Say no more, you've just...
But no, I'm going to give you the math. I'll give you the math.
Okay.
If you look at rifampin and isoniazid, the number of organisms that just have innate resistance are to the order of 10 to the 6th or 10 to the 9th.
Wow.
So if you just gave one drug, think of how many organisms would just be resistant.
Sure.
And that's why we try to approach it with
multiple
4 drugs.
Yeah, that's
because there are already organisms that are resistant. You're selecting for them.
Of course.
So that's the big. So it's really important when you're addressing tuberculosis that you make sure that they get all the adequate drugs, because the last thing we want is to be breeding, selecting for drug resistance,
that's exactly
and then having that spread through your communities.
Yeah. The other thing I heard, of course, was that within weeks after you start taking this drug, which you have to take for months, you start feeling much, much better. And you assume because you're feeling so much better, well, I don't have to take this anymore because I'm no longer suffering, but you really still are, right?
Yeah.
So compliance is about 90% of medicine anyway, so that's particularly true here.
And as mentioned, this can get a little more complicated. If it's CNS disease, you might be treating longer. Yeah. If there's a large cavity and they're still smear positive when you reassess at 2 months.
Right.
So again, people expert in treatment of tuberculosis. There usually will be centers and a lot of organizations around making sure this happens properly. Right. But I think the big takeaway, think about when you go to these areas, you may be putting you and your staff at risk. So have in place algorithms, approaches, so that patients that might have tuberculosis can be identified early before your clinic becomes an epicenter for the next local tuberculosis spread.
Right. Great.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us.
Yep, we'll be back soon.